I am honored and excited to be with you today to talk about organizational culture, talk a little bit about diversity, and to share what I believe you can do to make a really meaningful impact in whatever community, company, organization you serve. So, a couple of years ago, I had the honor of kicking off a 2-year-long research project called the Diversity Gap. And I was really hoping to better understand the space between our good intentions for organizational diversity and the impact of those intentions. Again and again, I would sit down with leaders and team members who would say, you know what, we care a lot about diversity. We want to see these changes within our organization, but the impact of all of our actions, it's not that great. It hasn't been great internally on us, and it really hasn't been great on the communities and on the people we are seeking to serve through these diversity initiatives in the first place. And so I wanted to better understand that gap. So over the course of 2 years, I sat down with over 100 entrepreneurs, thought leaders, diversity leaders, and underrepresented racial minorities within majority white cultural teams to better understand their experiences and to get some insight into how leaders were closing this gap between good intentions and good impact. So I want to share with you a couple of stories along with a few of the big lessons that I've learned, and I can't wait to share with you today. Now, story number one, it was my first day of interviews, again, a couple of years ago, and I organized this focus group with two Black women who worked in a large international nonprofit. And these two Black women, they had their roles on the team. One was in marketing, one was in programming, but they'd also self-elected to be a part of the diversity task force for the entire organization. And so in our conversation, I'm asking them all sorts of questions. I wanted to know about the strategies they were using, and I wanted to know about their daily experiences of coming to work. And I wanted to hear, what do you think? What is the diversity gap and how is it showing up in your context? One of the questions I asked was, can you be yourself in this environment? And over the course of the conversation, the words that these women kept using over and over and over again were things like, we feel heard when we come to work. We feel uplifted. We feel seen. We feel supported. We feel valued. We feel respected. Really beautiful, really bold, really positive words. One of the women said, because I can be myself here, I can bring my best to the rest of the work that I do. And so I walked away from that interview or that focus group thinking, this is incredible. Like, these Black women are having both a minority experience and a positive experience in their workplace. There's a lot we can learn from them. But then fast forward to my afternoon that day, and I'd set up one other interview with another Black woman who worked in an all-white, all-male architectural firm. And I asked her many of the same questions, wanting to better understand the diversity gaps that existed and her thoughts on how to close them. And over the course of the interview, she sounded pretty defeated and hopeless and quite lonely, actually. And I eventually asked her, can you be yourself at work? And here's what she said, and I'm going to read it verbatim from my notes here. She said, no, not at all. And I say that quite emphatically. It doesn't cause me stress or anything. It's so ingrained now, the code switching. I'm naturally a leader with a very dominant personality, but I don't want to be seen as an aggressive Black person, so I can't really be myself. As a woman, I have to make everything sound like a suggestion rather than a direct order. I end up always having to play this mediator role on my team. And she said, it's frustrating, never being able to be myself. Never being able to share honestly with my coworkers, especially when something is happening in the news. I have no Black coworkers because our firm is so small. I'm the only woman and the only Black person, and it can become exhausting and mentally draining. And so I asked her, well, do you think the diversity gap can be closed in your industry? And she said, no, I don't think so, not without major, major changes. And at the time of this conversation, she was actually in the process of looking for a new job because the workplace environment had become so toxic for her. So as I reflected on these two stories, analyzed the data, went back to, map it all out, see what I'd learned, it was interesting because these three women that I'd interviewed had a lot in common. They were all college educated. They all had advanced degrees in their area of expertise. They all had at least 5 years experience in their respective fields. There were many similarities. But there was one key difference that had the women from the morning thinking, hey, we feel heard and uplifted here, and had the woman in the afternoon trying to get out of that workplace environment. And the one difference that I could find was that the women in the morning had an incredibly intentional leader. They had an intentional leader. And I know that for some of you, this language of leadership might throw you off. You might not think of yourself as a leader, but being a leader simply means that you are being intentional with your influence, whether you are at work, at home, in your community, at your kids' school, wherever you have some degree of influence. If you're being intentional there, you have a degree of influence and leadership. And so yeah, they had an intentional leader. Even though their entire organization had a lot of work to do, they had one leader who was really proactive about three things. And these are the three things I want to walk through with you. The first is that an intentional leader dignifies people. Intentional leaders dignify people. They know that diversity is about dignity. It's not about numbers. It's not about quotas. It's not even about your business development strategy. It is about real people, real stories. It's about the people who matter to you. It's about the stories who matter to you. And diversity is about validating and celebrating a range of human experiences. That's what diversity is ultimately about. And to be an intentional leader means that you dignify every human being, every kind of human being who walks through the doors of your organization. And so, number one, intentional leaders dignify people. It's so simple, but we miss it sometimes. We dignify people. Number two, intentional leaders pay attention to power. They pay attention to power, especially within their organizational context. If you diversify your team without paying attention to power, you will be really hard pressed to create a culture that's truly inclusive. Now, what do I mean by paying attention to power? There are four kinds of power that I like to encourage leaders to pay attention to. I call it the MDiv. Sounds like a degree. But number one is money power. So who makes the most money, or who decides what happens with the money that is made? Those are two ways to trace power within your organization. Number two is decision-making power. Who makes the most decisions, or who makes the decisions that impact the most people? That's another way power shows up in an organization. Number three is general influence. This is all about, when that person walks into the room, everyone's eyes kind of follow them. They are the ones, their opinions, their thoughts, their charisma kind of sets the tone for what happens and what doesn't happen within an organization. That person has a lot of power, and that's a type of power to be considered as you're seeking to create a diverse and inclusive culture. And then lastly is voice. Voice is a really incredible aspect of building power within an organization. Who is setting the messaging? Who is setting the tone? Who is telling the stories and through what lens? So we have money, decisions, influence, and voice. Those are four areas where you have to be really intentional about how power is being used and wielded and shared or held, so that you can make sure that you're not only diversifying your culture, but you're creating a culture that is moving towards increased equity and increased inclusion. And then the third thing that intentional leaders do is that they practice a really costly hospitality. They practice costly hospitality. I interviewed a woman once who described that inclusion is it's made, or it falls apart in that moment when someone walks into a room for the first time and they're scanning to see the room to see if anyone's thought about them in that space. If you're inviting someone over for lunch or for dinner, you've thought about, what do they like to eat? What do they like to drink? Do they have any allergies? Where would they want to sit in my home? When you're being intentional about diversifying your organizational culture, you have to practice that level of hospitality at every point of interaction within your organization or company. And it can be costly to you, especially if you're comfortable in your organization and you don't want it to change. But if we're going to be serious about diversifying our cultures, about increasing inclusion, and ultimately about moving towards greater equity, then practicing costly hospitality is really the only way. And so intentional leaders make all the difference. They dignify people, they pay attention to power, they practice costly hospitality. And in closing, I want you to know that you have what it takes to create this kind of culture. You do. As a leader, as a person of some degree of influence, every day you are creating the culture of the future for your organization, both by your action and your inaction, by your silence and by when you speak up. All of these things matter. All of these things have an impact. And so I encourage you to be bold, to be brave, to take some risks, to see and dignify people, to give power away, and to go out of your way to include those who currently might not feel quite at home yet in the community that you're leading. You've got what it takes. May your really good intentions for diversity lead to true cultural change. Thank you.